Israeli snipers killing 7 innocent bystanders in the Jenin refugee camp, which is, of course, to say not Gaza. The dead included 2 teenagers and reportedly the director of the government hospital surgical ward. So these are soldiers putting 7 people into their lens, sniping them. They have the moment to see who these people are. It's in the West Bank. What's the explanation for this?
So I can't give you an explanation. You should ask the government of Israel for an explanation.
You talked about the dissolution of the Israeli war cabinet, said this was an internal matter, but it's not an internal matter if it affects who is in the direct line of decision-making over the use of US military assistance and US weapons, particularly in relation to this war. And we know it seems very likely now that the ministers for national security and finance will be a far more significant part of that decision-making process. Does that concern you?
We ultimately judge the decisions that the government of Israel makes, as we do with other governments, on the policy outcomes those decisions produce, not on the people making them. That's true no matter who is in the government. It will continue to be true.
But these are people you've repeatedly criticized for, I think, what you call destabilizing rhetoric, for, effectively what are their values. One is a convicted supporter of terrorism. Another is openly called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So if these people are now, in a direct line of decision-making over the war in Gaza, surely that's concerning.
Can I just ask one thing on that? You said we will judge Israel by the results. So it was April the 4th, President Biden basically threatened Israel to put conditions on aid if it wouldn't do a better job of protecting civilians and if more humanitarian aid wouldn't go into Gaza. It's been more than 2 months. U.S. government has taken no action and also has not basically made an assessment on how well or not Israel has done. So I don't quite understand the judgment.
So one question first on administrative detention. So you've discussed how civilians shouldn't be held as leverage with regards to, of course, the Israeli hostages. Israel has held thousands of Palestinians in administrative detention for months with no trial or charge. Our colleagues at CNN and the New York Times, of course, recently reported on a prison camp where thousands were rounded up and allegedly abused, tied up, assaulted, stripped. They're kept away from legal support and the Red Cross. And of course, Israel has said they're moving away from that specific camp. But what's being done to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again? What consequences are there? And then what about this larger issue of detention where thousands of Palestinians are just rounded up with apparent no legal or judicial accountability?
So we have made clear to the government of Israel on a number of occasions that they need to respect the human right.
Can I go to Gaza?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's been any progress on the ceasefire talks. Has there been any progress on the workables and not so workables of the Hamas counter-proposal since last week?
We continue to have conversations with the government of Israel, the governments of Egypt, and the government of Qatar, but I'm not going to get into the status of those conversations or any detail about those conversations from here. We do want to bridge the differences where we can. As you heard the Secretary say and as the President say, there are a number of things that we just think are non-starters and shouldn't have been in the response, go beyond what Hamas demanded previously, and hopefully those are demands that Hamas will back down from because we don't think that they're workable. But there are a number of areas where we think we can find agreement. Doesn't mean we will, because it takes 2 parties to come to an agreement, but we think it's possible to come to agreement, so we're going to continue to work on that.
Right, and has there been anything since last week that makes you a little bit more hopeful? Like any incremental progress on any of the things that you say can be bridgeable?
I just don't want to offer an assessment from here. Our bottom line of this is that this is what the Secretary said when he was in the region last week. Based on the differences between the 2 parties, we should be able to reach an agreement. If you just look at, let's take out some of the things that Hamas put in that are completely unworkable and that go beyond positions it has previously taken, because we don't think that's a good faith action to have an agreement or at least have accepted terms and then move the terms. Take out some of those areas. If you look at the remaining areas, we do think it should be possible to come to an agreement. Doesn't mean we will, but that the benefits to the region, the people of Gaza, the people of Israel, are so significant that we're going to continue to work to try to reach such an agreement.
Right. Amos Hochstein met with Netanyahu, I believe. Any more word from that meeting that lowers your level of concern about an escalation up north with Hezbollah?
So I will let the White House speak to Amos Hochstein's travel, because he's a White House employee, not a State Department employee. But I'll say our level of concern hasn't really changed. It continues continues to be something that we're worried about. And this is, it's not a new concern, obviously. We've been worried about escalation in the north and the possibility of a full-scale conflict between Israel and Hezbollah since the very early days after October 7th. And you've seen us work over the past 8 months to try to prevent that conflict from breaking out. You have seen Hezbollah escalate in the past few weeks with the number of strikes across the border, with the number of drones, and you've seen fires breaking out in Israeli villages. These are strikes that Hezbollah is conducting against civilian targets. So you have seen escalation that should stop, that we think they should refrain from. But our assessment of the situation continues to be that the best way to get a diplomatic resolution in the north, which we think all sides ultimately prefer, is to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. And so the two are related. Doesn't mean you can't say with 100% certainty that you wouldn't be able to get a ceasefire in the north without resolution in Gaza, but certainly having a ceasefire in Gaza makes a resolution in the north much, much easier.
And given that ceasefire still remains elusive, in the meantime, is the message to Israel, don't do anything in the north? That's the U.S. message.
We have made clear we don't want to see escalation at all in the north. We've made that clear directly to the government of Israel. Now, look, there is, as you've heard us say before, there's a situation that is untenable for Israel, and it's untenable for Lebanese families too, tens of thousands of which who have been forced to leave their homes and have been gone for over 8 months now and can't return to their homes because of the conflict there. So it is a situation that has to be resolved. But our preference is that it be resolved diplomatically, and that has been Israel's preference too. They've stated it publicly, they've stated it privately. Yeah.
Matt, do you have any comment on the dissolution of the war cabinet?
I don't. That's ultimately an internal matter for the government.
Do you anticipate this will make conversations with the Israeli government more challenging, easier, particularly around the ceasefire?
No, I'm just not going to offer any type of assessment about what it might mean. Ultimately, those decisions are decisions for the government of Israel and for the people of Israel. We will deal with whatever government is in place in Israel, as we have since the beginning of this administration, as the United States has, going back a number of administrations and over a number of different governments of Israel. It doesn't change our fundamental strategic interests. It doesn't change our fundamental assessment of the situation. We'll continue to have the very direct and candid conversations with members of the Israeli government as we have for some time.
And the Israeli government over the weekend announced these tactical pauses that they say is meant to increase the amount of aid that's going around Gaza. Aid groups say they haven't seen any impact at this point. What's the U.S. read on this?
So that is a step that we very much welcome. It's something that we have been encouraging for some time. Our special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues, Lise Grande, has been directly advocating for these pauses in her conversation with Israeli officials, and she's been doing that because of her work on the ground, meeting with UN relief agencies and other relief agencies about what they need to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance inside Gaza. We continue to have a tough situation where there is now a fair amount of aid that's making it to Kerem Shalom, but then not always being distributed from Kerem Shalom to the inside of Gaza. Some of that is because of the conflict in Rafah. Some of that is the instability in the security situation on the ground, where you see trucks that are in some instances attacked by private parties, by looters and criminals. This removes one of those obstacles. Now, look, it'll probably take a few days to see how it's actually implemented for people to adjust to this new reality, but we think it's a step that's very positive that ought to improve the distribution situation inside Gaza.
And how does the U.S. intend to hold Israel accountable for honoring these tactical pauses? We've seen a number of instances where they said that areas were protected, that humanitarians would be protected, and then ultimately the results on the ground don't bear that out.
So ultimately we judge Israel by the results. And when it comes to it's not just a question of humanitarian pauses, it's to the question of how much aid gets delivered. The pause ultimately is only a means to an end. The humanitarian pause is to ensure that, number one, aid can get delivered where it needs to go, and number two, relief workers have certainty that they can carry out their jobs without being hit by an airstrike or by tank fire or by any other kind of ordinance. So it's important that Israel has put this step in place, and we'll watch how it's implemented. And if there are changes that need to be made, we of course won't hesitate to make that clear.
Can I just ask one thing on that? You said we will judge Israel by the results. So it was April the 4th, President Biden basically threatened Israel to put conditions on aid if it wouldn't do a better job of protecting civilians and if more humanitarian aid wouldn't go into Gaza. It's been more than 2 months. U.S. government has taken no action and also has not basically made an assessment on how well or not Israel has done. So I don't quite understand the judgment part.
So it's because we have seen them take steps that have been productive, not always perfect in every instance, but let me just go through some of them. So we saw after that phone call and after the president made clear that our policy would be dependent on the results, we saw the opening of Zekum, we saw the opening of Erez crossing, we saw the opening of Ashdod for deliveries to come in, we saw the opening of the Jordan route, so you now have trucks that are coming directly from Jordan, crossing through Israel, in some cases crossing through the West Bank and going directly to the north. It's a significant improvement. Now, we also saw in the south initially an increase in the number of trucks in, but then barriers since the beginning of the Rafah operation. So what we judge Israel by is now that we have somewhat stabilized, not by any chance gotten the north to where it needs to be, but at least stabilized the situation from where it was 2 months ago. How do we improve the situation in the north in the wake of, in the south in the wake of the Rafah operation? The humanitarian pause is one step that we wanted to see them do to help improve that situation. There are others that we continue to work with them on.
But Matt, aid groups say in the north it's gotten just as bad as it was before.
So we have seen, so we don't have people on the ground to make an assessment. We will look to the groups that make assessments to tell us what the actual situation is. But you have seen a significant increase in assistance going into the north. When before that phone call, there wasn't a large amount of assistance that was going in. Everyone knows those stories very well. We have now seen assistance going in. Now, look, when we see reports from humanitarian groups, say the IPC that issues reports from time to time, we will take a look at those, and if there are things that need to change, we won't hesitate to be direct with Israel about how they need to make those changes. But we have seen an improvement in the aid situation going in the north, and we've seen somewhat of a stagnation in the south, and that's what we want to see reversed.
But that improvement in the steps didn't actually translate into results, because you just said that the distribution hasn't improved, and that has a lot to do, especially in the south, with the start of the Rafah operation. Okay, it's not the major, you guys don't call it the major military operation, but in the end, it basically obstructed the delivery of aid, and that was an action taken by Israel.
So the point I made, it's not just the Rafah operation. There has also been attacks on trucks, attacks on humanitarian convoys coming in by common criminals and looters. That isn't an action taken by the government of Israel, but it's something that we're looking to work with Israel and our UN partners and others to try to resolve and try to find an answer to.
Okay, final thing on this. Is the U.S. government actually going to give itself a certain time frame on when to deliver or make an assessment on what the president said on April the 4th?
It is an ongoing assessment every day. We're every day.
Well, if there is an assessment, then there's got to be an action.
No, it is every day we are looking at seeing if there are improvements being made, if there are actions that the government of Israel is taking that are sufficient, and it is something that is ongoing. And I said this at the time. You shouldn't look for a magic date where we're going to look and go, okay, everything's fine now. We're going to look at this all the time and make sure that if assistance isn't going in at the level it needs to, that we push the government of Israel to take action to get humanitarian assistance in. If there are things that the UN agencies need to do to further resolve logistical hurdles, we want to work with them to try to resolve those logistical hurdles, because ultimately our goal is to get as much humanitarian assistance in as possible. I should say, however, that we've been going over this for months because of the inherent difficulty of delivering humanitarian assistance in the middle of a conflict. The best way to resolve this and to surge humanitarian assistance in and get through a number of these logistical hurdles and security hurdles would be a ceasefire. It's why we continue to push to try to get a ceasefire agreement, because not every one of these issues, but a number of these issues that are presented by trying to deliver aid in the middle of an ongoing conflict would be at least mitigated, if not fully resolved. Yeah.
You talked about the dissolution of the Israeli war cabinet, said this was an internal matter, but it's not an internal matter if it affects who is in the direct line of decision making over the use of US military assistance and US weapons, particularly in relation to this war. And we know it seems very likely now that the ministers for national security and finance will be far more significant part of that decision-making process. Does that concern you?
We ultimately judge the decisions that the government of Israel makes, as we do with other governments, on the policy outcomes those decisions produce, not on the people making them. That's true no matter who is in the government. It will continue to be true.
But these are people you've repeatedly criticised for, I think, what you call destabilising rhetoric, for, effectively what are their values. One is a convicted supporter of terrorism. Another has openly called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So if these people are now, in a direct line of decision-making over the war in Gaza, surely that's a concern for you.
So those are people who have always been in the cabinet, and we have made clear when they take actions that we disagree with. We've made that clear publicly, and I can tell you we've had some very direct conversations privately as well with the senior members of the government of Israel about those policies that we think are unproductive, not only to the plight of the Palestinian people, but to Israel's security. Ultimately, though, it is not for us to pass judgment on who ought to be in the government of Israel or who ought to not be in the government of Israel, or into the cabinet. That's just not a decision for the United States to make. We don't decide who is in the cabinet of any other country. That is a decision for the people of Israel to make. Ultimately, what our job is to interact with whatever government they choose and make clear what we think the policies they should pursue that are in their best interest and the best interest of the region. And we're going to do that whoever is in the government. Now, that said, when we see decisions when we see decisions with which we disagree, we will not hesitate to make those disagreements known. And that has been true before the dissolution of the war cabinet, and it will continue to be true.
But I mean, no one's asking you to decide who's in the cabinet, but you frequently have views on members of other governments, and this is one of your closest allies. So based on the policy decisions that they take, and so that's what I'm trying to speak to. When members of that government have made policy decisions with which we disagree, we speak out on those, and that will continue to be the case. That was the case before the war cabinet. It was the case when the war cabinet decided things that we didn't agree with, and that'll be our guiding principle going forward, no matter who is in the government, going one way or the other. And do you have any policies or protocols on convicted terrorism supporters being in a key part of the decision making over a war being conducted by your ally in using U.S. military assistance?
Ultimately, we expect governments that receive U.S. military assistance to operate in line with international humanitarian law. That'll continue to be our expectation of Israel and everybody else. Go ahead, Michelle.
I have a couple of questions. One on Amos 16. Are there any new ideas or proposals that he's taking to the region during this visit?
So as I said, and I think it was response to Humaira's question, might have been Jenny, apologize if so. I'm going to let the White House speak to Amos Hochstein's travel, just because he's a White House employee, and I don't typically speak to the travel and meetings of employees of other agencies or other offices within the government from here. That said, ultimately, there is a diplomatic framework that we believe we can reach, we believe is reachable, that would resolve this conflict without a full-on war. And I'm not going to get into the details of that from here, but it's something that we have been in discussions with the various parties with for some time. And it's something we're going to continue to push for, but it is something we believe will be much easier to achieve should we get a ceasefire. And you heard the president speak to that when he laid out the proposal that Israel had put forward, I think, over 2 weeks ago now, and that continues to be our assessment.
And one on Libya. 2 Russian warships are visiting a military base in eastern Libya. Do you have any comment on that?
Let me take that back and get you a comment.
And finally, on Sudan, any new updates on U.S. efforts to stop the war, and especially that the secretary talked today to Saudi foreign minister?
So I'll say that, as you've heard from us before, the war in Sudan is catastrophic. The humanitarian situation demands more regional and international attention and response. We are deeply alarmed by the reports of ongoing atrocities, including ethnic-based killings. We are demanding an end to the fighting in El Fasher and that all parties protect civilians, as indicated by our work to pass a UN Security Council resolution last week on June 13th. We continue to call on the SAF and the RSF to engage in direct negotiations, to immediately end the fighting, to adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, and to take immediate steps to improve humanitarian access to meet the emergency needs of civilians. And yes, the Secretary did have a conversation with the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia about this very thing earlier today. It's something that he has been discussing with the Foreign Minister going back months, as well as, of course, other leaders in the region. We continue to urge both parties to return to talks and find a way to resolve this situation, because we think there's ultimately no way to win this conflict militarily.
Thank you.
Brent, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. So one question first on administrative detention. So you've discussed how civilians shouldn't be held as leverage with regards to, of course, the Israeli hostages. Israel has held thousands of Palestinians in administrative detention for months with no trial or charge. Our colleagues at CNN and the New York Times, of course, recently reported on a prison camp where thousands were rounded up and allegedly abused, tied up, assaulted, stripped. They're kept away from legal support and the Red Cross. And of course, Israel has said they're moving away from that specific camp. But what's being done to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again? What consequences are there? And then what about this larger issue of detention where thousands of Palestinians are just rounded up with apparent no legal or judicial accountability?
So we have made clear to the government of Israel on a number of occasions that they need to respect the human rights of Palestinians in both Gaza and in the West Bank, and that whenever anyone is detained, there needs to be full due process for those individuals, and they need to be treated in strict compliance with international humanitarian law.
Okay, so will there be any sort of like material response to this specific camp beyond just, of course, this one's shutting down? But
I can't speak to this specific one. Ultimately, our expectation is that they ought to give people due process. They ought to treat them treat them with full respect for their human rights and with in full accordance with international humanitarian law.
And then on your mention of the West Bank, Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, reported recently on Israeli snipers killing 7 innocent bystanders in the Jenin refugee camp, which is, of course, to say not Gaza. The dead included 2 teenagers and reportedly the director of the government hospital surgical ward. So these are soldiers putting 7 people into their lens, sniping them. They have the moment to see who these people are. It's in the West Bank. What's the explanation for this?
So I can't give you an explanation. You should ask the government of Israel for an explanation. I would say that in any kind of incident like that, what ought to happen is that there ought to be an investigation. Israel ought to conduct an investigation. If it's IDF soldiers, the IDF ought to conduct the investigation. If it's INP, it ought to be the INP that conducts an investigation. If there is, if they find wrongdoing, there ought to be full accountability and full transparency.